Good evening, everyone. We're going to go ahead and get started. If you can just find a seat. Looks like we have a pretty full house here tonight, and I'm not surprised. All right, well, good evening. My name is Jennifer Chiswick. I am the Chief Operating Officer and Senior Assistant Dean at the Haas School. I'd like to welcome everyone to the Dean Speaker Series. And I want to provide a special welcome to our guests from across campus attending tonight. We have a co-sponsoring group tonight. We have the Center for South Asia Studies and the Department of South and Southeast Asian Studies. And then you may not realize it, but the audience is even bigger than what's in here tonight. We have virtual guests joining us, many from our evening and weekend MBA program, our Haas alumni, and our executive MBA program, and they're watching via our webcast. So welcome to them as well. Since we have a lot of new faces here, I just wanted to say a few words about the Dean Speaker Series. What it is it brings distinguished individuals who are leaders of business and other organizations who have made unique and significant contributions to their industry. And it is the highest level of speaker series that we have at the Haas School. And we've just been fortunate over the years to have many outstanding and inspirational individuals. And tonight's speaker is absolutely no exception. And to introduce our speaker, I am going to ask Professor Goldman. He is the Catherine and William L. Magistretti Distinguished Professor in South and Southeast Asian Studies. He's going to do the honors of introducing Mr. Das. And I have to also thank Professor Goldman. He was very instrumental in bringing Mr. Das to campus as part of our Regents lectureship program. So without further comment, I want to welcome Professor Robert Goldman.
Thank you, Jennifer, for your introduction of me. And I would like to get on to the main event of the evening and not take too much of the time. But it's, for me, an extraordinary pleasure and honor to be able to introduce my old friend and colleague, Gurcharan Das, who is here, as Jennifer mentioned, in the very distinguished position of Regents Lecturer this semester, and is also here as a visiting scholar attached to the Department of South and Southeast Asian Studies, where he and I are leading a weekly reading group in the subject of desire, Kama, the Kama Sutra. But he has many hats and is in many ways a kind of contemporary Renaissance man. He's an author, a commentator, advisor, and a general management guru. He was CEO of Procter & Gamble India and later managing director, Procter & Gamble Worldwide, in strategic planning. Prior to Procter & Gamble, he was chairman and managing director of Richardson Hindustan Limited. Mr. Das graduated with honors from Harvard University in philosophy, where he studied Sanskrit as well, and this is our connection, and attended Harvard Business School, where he is featured in 3 case studies. He is on a number of Indian and global boards, including the Global Advisory Board of Walmart. He's a regular speaker to the managements of the world's largest corporations. He has served on the juries for the Templeton Prize, the McKinsey Award, and the Milton Friedman Prize. In 1995, after a 30-year career, he took early retirement to devote his time to writing. He is the author of 2 international bestsellers, India Unbound, a huge smash bestseller, which kind of tore the lid off the old license Raj of India, a narrative account of India from independence to the global information age, and he has been published in 17 languages and filmed by the BBC. He is also the author of The Difficulty of Being Good on the Subtle Art of Dharma, which goes back to his interest in Sanskrit literature because it tries to look at the ethics of the great Hindu epic, the Mahabharata, in terms of contemporary ethics and politics. It's subtitled On the Subtle Art of Dharma. So we've covered now Artha and Dharma, Penguin book. A riveting examination of moral failure, bad governance, and corruption in our modern world. His latest book, what she's going to speak to us tonight, India Grows at Night, A Liberal Case for a Strong State, was published in late 2012. He writes a regular column in 5 of the major Indian newspapers, including Times of India, and also periodic guest columns in the Wall Street Journal, the Financial Times, Foreign Affairs, and the New York Times. His other literary works include a novel, A Fine Family, a book of essays, The Elephant Paradigm, and an anthology of 3 plays, one of which was performed off-Broadway by La Mama. So quite an interesting gentleman, Mr. Das, and it's a great pleasure for me to be able to introduce him to you tonight. So please, without further ado, join me in welcoming tonight's Dean Speaker.
Thank you, Bob. Thank you, Jennifer. He called me a management guru, and let me quickly tell you that such a guru is someone who's good at understanding GU, but relatively useless, RU. Of course, the word guru is also in my name, so that presents a problem. But it wasn't always so. Until the age of 3, my name was Ashok Kumar, which means Prince of Happiness. But my grandmother suspected that my mother gave me that name because she thought my mother was secretly in love with a Bollywood actor named Ashok Kumar. So this wasn't right. So she took me to her guru. She placed me at his feet and told the guru to give this boy a name. And the guru, seeing me there, said, well, let's call him Gurcharan Das. So overnight, I was transformed from the Prince of Happiness to the humble servant of the feet of the guru, which is what my name means. I think the guru was also sending me a message, which was about the virtue of humility. And, in my life, I've been fortunate to meet many leaders, both political leaders, business leaders. And they had two qualities in common. One was not intelligence, but determination, willpower. And the second was humility. And humility doesn't mean that you are not ambitious. These people were hugely ambitious, but your ambition is for your company, your project, what you're doing, rather than for your stock options. We've had a prime minister in India who has had enormous intelligence. Perhaps the most intelligent leader is a PhD in economics from Cambridge University, and he has had a lot of humility. But he has been a failure. And why? Because he lacked determination. So, that's, since we are talking in a business school, I think that's something that you may want to think about. Now, I'm going to talk to you about the future of India. And let me begin by asking you to remember 4 numbers. 1, 3.5, 6, and 8. This sums up the story of the Indian economy over the last 100 years. India grew at 1% from 1900 to 1950, the colonial period. And the population also grew at 1%. So 1 minus 1, 0 was the per capita income. And we rightly said that India was a stagnant economy. The British knew many things, but they didn't know how to make an economy which they ruled successful. After independence in 1947, the growth rate picked up, and from 1950 to 1980, that growth rate went to 3.5%. But the population also went up to 2.2, so 3.5 minus 2.2 is 3.5, and that is an unsatisfactory rate of growth for a poor country. That, by the way, is the rate of growth of the U.S. economy over 100 years. But that was after the U.S. had already achieved a certain level of income. From mid-1980s, the economy really picked up. And 91, it zoomed. And so the rate of growth went from 3.5% to 6% for the next 22 years, up till 2002, 6%, 1980 to 2002. And then from 2002 to 2011, 2012, you've went to 8%. And 5 years, you have 8 or 9%. And that was the period India was the second fastest growing economy in the world. Now, those of you who get very depressed, as I do, with the current situation, when the rate of growth has dropped to 5, I remind myself about this 100-year trend. And I tell myself that obviously you can't always project from the past to the future. But there are long-term trends in the destiny of nations. And so let me begin with the good news. And the good news is that I think India will get back to 7-8% growth rate. Now, just 2 years ago, India was the envy of the world. As I said, it was growing at 8.5%. It had successfully weathered the global financial crisis and was creating masses of jobs. And today, when I say that it's dropped down to 5%, this has brought a lot of pain. You've got to remember, sometimes these numbers, sound like just numbers we are throwing around. But 1% growth rate is equal to 1.5 million direct jobs. Each direct job creates 3 indirect jobs, so that's total 6 million jobs. And each job supports 5 people. That's 30 million people with one job. And 4%, when you drop your growth rate, you've affected 120 million people's lives. And I hope they don't forget this at election time in a few months from now. So what happened? Why did this second fastest growing economy suddenly fall down? Now, part of the reason, of course, is the global financial situation. But I think it's the smaller part of the reason. The bigger part is that it has taken a great deal of talent on the part of this government to achieve this dropping of the growth rate. And the main reason is that they made a false trade-off. A trade-off between growth and equity in the name of a very seductive expression called inclusive growth. They assumed that growth was on autopilot. It was India's God-given right to be growing at 8-9%. And they took their eyes off the ball and So they ignored the engine drivers of growth, like infrastructure, and they began to spend massively on social welfare, the most dramatic example of which was a guarantee of 100 days of work to everyone at a minimum wage, for which they got huge electoral returns, mind you, in the last election in 2009. They also waived loans to farmers, sending the brilliant signal to honest farmers that it doesn't pay to be honest and that it's better to default on your loans. So not surprisingly, shortages developed in the economy, certainly in the infrastructure, in power, in coal, which are the feedstocks of the power plants. Every country has to protect its environment. But sensible governments do not bring to a halt 700 projects that are in the works for environmental reasons. Anyway, all this inflationary, unproductive spending put inflationary pressures. Our equivalent to the Fed, the Reserve Bank, our equivalent to the Fed, the Reserve Bank, raised interest rates, and that hurt growth more. So I asked myself, why did this happen? Especially a government led by a dream team of economists educated at Cambridge, Oxford, Harvard. And one of the problems, of course, was that the real power in this government was not with the Prime Minister and this dream team of reformers, but with an Italian lady named Sonia Gandhi, who comes from a part of Italy which was communist. And she genuinely believes that social welfare is more important than growth, and forgets that unless you have growth, how will you afford to have social welfare programs? Anyway, as I told you, we've had the weakest prime minister in India's history. And one of the, as I mentioned earlier, one of the mistakes we make, not just mistakes in the public sphere when we elect our representatives, political leaders, but also in the business world. We overvalue intelligence. We, typically, when the recruiter comes to the Haas School, he will say, my God, top of the class. And he went to Yale as an undergraduate. He must be good. Let's take him. And when we know from experience now that it is attitude that matters, it is qualities like determination that make the difference between being a great leader and just a person who produces a good report. And so you can always train people in skills, but you cannot train them in attitude. And I hope at Haas you have courses which train people in attitude, because that's really what matters when the rubber hits the road. The other factor is, the other reason why this mistake, this gigantic, monumental mistake took place, was that the reformers, the Prime Minister and this dream team, did not bother to sell the reforms to the people. So the people got the impression that economic reforms, which is about freeing the economy from government control, is about making the rich richer and the poor poorer. And they went about doing the reforms by stealth when no one was looking. Nobody bothered to say to the people that, look, reforms means creating a competitive market. When you create a competitive market, then the costs come down of firms, quality rises, and with good regulators, it leads to a rules-based capitalism. And that is being pro-market. But the distinction is there's a difference between being pro-market and pro-business. Pro-business means that you keep control in the government to give out licenses, and this leads to crony capitalism. Now people feel that business, market, there's no difference, and therefore all business is crony capitalism. Margaret Thatcher used to say that she used to spend 20% of her time doing the reforms and 80% selling the reforms. Anyway, I think the government woke up basically a little bit over a year ago and realized what damage they had done. So we've had a finance minister who was actually in San Francisco a few weeks ago, and he's been trying to undo some of the damage. There have been some reforms. And as I said, I think India will come back. And from a long-term standpoint, there are a couple of challenges. One of them is that the growth model of India is unique. This is to say that the rest of the world, both the West, the Industrial Revolution that took place in the West, and also the way in the East, the countries, Japan, Korea, Taiwan, and now China, they're rising on the basic principle of one, exports. Exports of started with cheap manufactures. India is rising on the basis of its domestic market. Oh, it has exports, but they don't play the big role. The second factor is that all countries have risen on the basis of manufacturing, manufactured exports. India is rising. The engine driver has been services, outsourcing, and many other kinds of services. And the third difference is that the rest of the world rose on the basis of investment. India is rising on the basis of consumption. In fact, only the United States has a higher consumption to GDP ratio than India. India has a higher consumption ratio than certainly China, but also Europe. And even manufacturing, India's manufacturing is high-tech manufacturing using a lot of software and robotics, rather than the labor-intensive, low-tech manufacturing, which creates millions of jobs. So the question really, in my mind, is how are we going to take the people from the farms to the cities? People don't want to live on the farms. No, as they say, the truth is you'd rather be a starving proletariat than a starving peasant. So you have to make people, urbanization is inevitable. And so this is an issue. The second issue that we have is the issue of governance. And that's really what I want to focus on today. That's really why I wrote this book, India Grows at Night. And the fact is that India is a bottom-up success, unlike China, which is a top-down success. By bottom-up success, meaning it's the success of the people, almost despite the state. And China's is a success orchestrated by an amazing technocratic elite in China. And this is why India has produced today 25 globally competitive companies. And in a few years, some of these will be brand names that you will recognize, like Samsung and Sony, etc. Behind these 25 are another 25. If you want to make money, you invest in those 25. So, I have a Chinese friend who comes to visit me, and he invests in India. And he hasn't been coming recently because I think he thinks I'm not giving him good stock tips. But one day he came, by the way, he's the one who said to me that China would die to have those 25 world-class companies. He says we have big companies in China, but they are state-controlled mostly. And so it would be very hard to compete in a global market with a state-controlled company. And so one day he came to me with a backache. And I said, what's the problem? And he said, your roads. He says, I've been going to these factories in Haryana, and how did you become the second fastest growing economy in the world with roads like these? So I explained to him that India grows at night when the government sleeps, which means that India has risen almost despite the state. And so he thought for a few minutes, and then he said, you mean India has risen with one hand tied? And I said, yes. And so he said, you know, the nightmare of the Chinese leadership should be, what if that second hand got untied one day? Now, the mistake we make is to think that the race between India and China is about who will get rich first. That's not the race. Both countries will turn into middle-income countries, but then both will get stuck. Both countries believe their destiny is to reach $40,000 per capita income. That's the income of the United States, roughly. And the fact is that the one who will win the race will be if China fixes its politics before India fixes its governance, then China will win the race. And if India fixes its governance before China fixes its politics, India will win the race. And the per capita income is not going to be the factor which is going to lead you from the... So this concept is called the middle income trap. And the Latin American countries were stuck in it for decades at the end of the last century. The other mistake we make is to believe that the state in India has become weak in recent times. Well, the fact is that India has always been a weak state and a strong society, and China has been a strong state and a weak society. And the fact is you need both. You need a strong state to get things done, to act decisively, quickly when required, and you need a strong society to make that state accountable. The history of India has been a history of kingdoms competing, fighting with each other through history. And China's history has been a history of empires. The Chinese person has been defined by the state, by the emperor, and the mandarins who control the state. And the Indian has been defined by the village, the caste, and the joint family. In China, the emperor gave the law and then he interpreted the law. In India, the law preceded the king. Law meaning dharma preceded the king, and the king's job was to uphold dharma for the sake of the people. And the interpreter of the law was not the king, but the Brahmin. So very early on, in 5th, 6th century BC, you had created a liberal division of powers which weakened the state. So oppression in India never came from the state. Oppression in China always came from the state. Oppression in India came from society, from the Brahmins. And the answer to that oppression was the Buddha, or a spiritual entrepreneur who came along every few years, and he took the people forward. The Indians are accumulators and Chinese are assimilators. By this I mean that both countries were peopled by migrations from Central Asia. In China, when they came there, and some of them were the same people, when they came to China, they assimilated into one Han identity. In India, we accumulated them into a 2,200 subcastes, which we call jatis. So if China is like a soup, India is like a salad, where you can see the vegetables, or like a biryani, we could call it, if you know the biryani. And so in India, so in 1947, India could only become a democracy, and not surprisingly, China became a totalitarian state. And so today, India is rising from below, and China is rising from above. And so the question that I pose, so this is a little background to the two countries, but mainly to understand how we're going to cope with this issue of governance in India, the corruption, etc. I mean, Indians ask every day, they say, why should it take us 10 years to build a road when it should have taken us 3 years? Why should it take us 10 years to get justice in the courts when it should take 2-3 years? And so that's when while they sip their chai, they say India grows at night when the government sleeps. Now, the subtitle of my book, which is, by the way, it's called India Grows at Night. But I thought it'd be too insulting to complete the full sentence in the title. So the subtitle is A Case for a Liberal, Strong State. And that's what I want to spend a few minutes on with you this evening. What is a liberal, strong state? Well, don't let the word strong put you off. I'm not talking about Stalin's Russia or Mao's China. We're talking about the state that was in the minds of the founding fathers of your country. It was in the minds of the founding fathers of India. And essentially, such a state has 3 pillars. One, it has an executive capable of taking quick, decisive, determined action when needed. That action is bounded by the rule of law. That's the second pillar. And third, that action is accountable to the people. That's the third pillar. So how do we create such a strong liberal state? Because I believe that is at the root of the problems of governance that we face in India today. which is why we need to reform the bureaucracy, the police, and the judiciary in order to succeed. Now, you've seen Obama in recent years and the Obamacare. And so you won't think of the United States immediately as an example of a liberal, strong state because you say, oh my God, our chief executive, he's so powerless. He can't even get a health bill through the Congress. Now, this happens to the best democracies. They go through periods when the executive, there's a gridlock. But by and large, the US has been able, in its 200 plus years of history, to demonstrate essentially that it is a strong liberal state. How do we bring such a state to India where roads can get built quickly, the justice can come quickly? And the difficult thing about these three pillars is that they do not reinforce each other like the pillars of this building. Sometimes they undermine each other. Too much pressure for accountability actually makes the executive weak. And that's what's happened in India. These anti-corruption movements have paralyzed the state. And I also blame the profession of political science, by the way. For 100 years, political scientists have been worried about accountability. 90% of the literature is accountability. Almost no concern has been shown for state capacity. And that is the issue. It's an issue, unlike China, which is an issue of a very different nature, where they don't have liberty, etc. We have lots of liberty, too much liberty sometimes. But we need to be able to manage. Anyway, I think if we are lucky, I know it's in 5 minutes, half this group of people is going to get up, and they're going to run for the doors. And so I've prepared myself not to feel too bad. But I would like to finish, if I can, in 5 minutes, because we can do a lot of things in the Q&A after some of you have to go. But I think if India is lucky, it could have a strong leader who is also a reformer, somebody like Margaret Thatcher. But I think the future in India lies with the new middle class. India is a young country. Half the population below 26. 40% people did not exist before 91. And they're going to vote for the first time. So we're going to see some surprises in this election. And I personally think that it's that new middle class, or the people who are aspiring to that middle class, is about 1/3 of India today. And it will be half of India by 2020. So politics has to change. And I think these people, unlike their parents, they're impatient. They've come up on their own. There's no silver bullet in terms of an answer to governance. It'll be like England. England took 100 years. Now I hope we won't. You know, England before in the early 19th century was a very corrupt country. You could buy a seat in Parliament. You called them rotten boroughs. You could buy any seat. You could buy any job in the government if you wanted. But they did their reform acts, and they got their act together. Now, that's the way we are going to have to do it. And I do believe there's one inspiration, and that comes from the United States. The greatest book written on democracy was by a man called Tocqueville, de Tocqueville, who wrote Democracy in America. He talked about neighborhood engagement. And I meet lots of young people like you here today, particularly after I wrote this book. They want to start a new party, they want to do something. And I tell them 1 hour a week they must spend on their neighborhood. Not just vote, but spend 1 hour a week on your neighborhood. Don't worry about corruption of the politician who's been caught with a bribe in Delhi. Worry about corruption in your neighborhood. So in closing, let me just say very quickly that I've been pretty negative about India. But let me put this in perspective. This book of mine was born in Tahrir Square in Egypt. I was invited by the democracy movement to come and present the India model for the future of Egypt. And the Egyptians asked me 3 questions. One, how did you get the generals out of power? How did you keep the generals out of power? And I said, we've never thought about this question. For 65 years, we've never thought about it. And they said, you don't realize how far you've come, because every democracy today which wants to be a democracy is facing that problem. The second question they asked was that they said 11% of Egypt is Christian, Coptic Christian, and 13% of India is Muslim. They said, we believe the Muslims of India feel secure, but the Christians of Egypt feel insecure. So how did you do that? Now again, that came as a surprise to me, because I didn't think of India as a model of secularism. We've had Gujarat 2002 riots, 1984 riots, and I told them this, but they said, no, you don't realize that the Indian Muslim is the least radicalized, least fundamentalized Muslim in the world. So you got done something that's significant. The third question they asked was, how did you get that outsourcing business? So that we can also get some of it and become a fast-growing economy. Well, I mentioned this story at the end because I wanted to say that I think India has come a long way. And it's still the largest democracy. It's a fast-growing economy. And the greatest, the most important, the defining event of my life is the rise of India. I was the first person to predict it in 1999, 2000, when India Unbound came out, and people thought I was smoking. But the fact of the matter is that when Western countries are in the middle of angst, thinking what is the right, have they followed the right model of capitalism in the world, and the inequality that it has created in a country like yours, there's another country rising, a large country rising in the East, which has been built on the classical principles that built the West: political and economic liberty. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Gurcharan, for this very, very interesting, provocative talk. We're going to open up the floor for those who would like to ask questions, which I'll take in a second. But I want to make another announcement. In connection with his appointment here as Regents Lecturer, Gurcharan will be giving 2 additional lectures, one on the 20th and one on the 14th of the coming month. Please watch the events page on the university and on the Center for South Asia Studies. At those events, there will be all 3 of his books available for book signing if any of you wish to purchase it at that time. So please do watch that. And now let's open it. You had a question here.
And I'll just ask people, since we're taping, to please come up to the microphones. Yeah, and you can line up by the microphones, and we'll take some online questions as well. But go ahead, please.
Thanks a lot. This was very informative, and I definitely learned a lot. I would respectfully like to disagree with one of your assertions, and that is your view on why India dropped from 8% to 5%. You explicitly mentioned the social programs that the Indian government invested on. I'm with you on criticizing the government in many ways. The only thing that I agree with them is actually the investments they made in the governance, in the social programs. If you see in the Europe and even in the US, the Western countries actually spend more as a percentage of GDP on social programs than India does.
No,
and India, writers such as P. Sainath have written that the corporate write-offs in India is staggering. And why did you not address that as the corporate write-offs? So in other words, the receipts that the Indian government is supposed to get from corporations or businesses is massive. And that is cited by many writers as a big reason for not being able to fuel the growth in India and not the social programs. Can you comment on that, please?
Okay. First of all, I did not want to suggest that it's either or. I said it was a false trade-off because they took their eyes off the ball of growth. I would, if those programs, if that money could reach those people with which it's intended, I'd be the first one to support it. But more than 50% of that money is wasted today because of lack of state capacity. The things we've been talking about. So therefore, I feel you are throwing money away in a poor country which cannot afford to throw money away, and it's lost in corruption. And the second part of your question was, for some reason you're saying the corporate sector doesn't pay taxes? Is that what you're saying?
Not the mechanism of getting taxes is very inefficient, and that has been...
That to some extent is correct, but I would just say that the vast amount, there will always be crooks in every society who won't pay their taxes, but the vast amount of the organized corporate sector, I'm not talking about a garage which runs with two mechanics, but by and large they pay their taxes. Now, you gave the example of Europe, countries of the West which spend a large part on social spending. I think you have to be a certain level, you have to reach a certain level of prosperity before you can afford to spend money. And I would personally, I would focus on getting the money to the people, and two, I would focus on growth. Because growth is what gives you the money to actually then, through taxes, to spend on welfare programs. So it's not an either-or issue.
Back there, there's a question. Please come to the microphones if you want to ask a question.
Yeah, so in your article about entrepreneurs and eggplants, you had basically called out that erratic corporate or erratic state governance is dissuading entrepreneurial investment in countries, especially in India. Do you, I don't know, it seems to be a common theme of erratic governance dissuading investment in countries like, Russia, Brazil, plenty of countries in Africa. I guess as an entrepreneur, what should give us the most confidence that India is going to figure out that form of strong state governance more quickly and more sustainably than some of those other countries, so that entrepreneurs say, I want to invest there today and in the future?
Yeah. Well, I wish I could say immediately yes, that India will do it, but it will be it will take time. In a democracy, unless you're really lucky to get a strong leader who's also a reformer. We had a strong leader in Indira Gandhi, but she was not a reformer. She was not a builder of institutions, she was a destroyer of institutions. So we don't want that kind of strong leader. Otherwise, in democracies, it takes time. And that's why I pin my hope on the youth to solve these governance issues. But I can only say that while justice is slow, it catches up on you in India. I mean, we used to, at Procter & Gamble, we marketed a number of our products, like oil of Olay, for example, and Vicks Vapor Rub, Gillette blades. And we found that in every country in Asia, there were copying. People used to copy those brand names. They used to pass off. It's called passing off. And in India was the one country that could stop it right away because it was a crime. It was a crime, and we worked with the police. We found those forgers, and we were able to stop it. So the other thing is that when it comes to corruption, corruption exists only in a few sectors. And these are the unreformed sectors, like mining, real estate. For me, I mean, when I was running Procter & Gamble, only once in 20 years did a demand come to me for a bribe. And we were building our detergent factory. And the engineer from the government who was going to sanction the load for a high-tension wire refused to give, unless we paid him a bribe of 50,000 rupees, which was now $1,000, but maybe then it was a couple of thousand. And we refused to do it. And then we went public, and we gave out his name in public and disgraced him, and so on. So I would just say that because India has a free press, you get the stories of corruption get disseminated much faster. And of course, when you have 120 news channels, we have 120 news channels, by the way, in all languages. And they're all looking for news 24/7.
Here, you have the question.
Sorry, one thing that I heard a lot when I worked in India was that there was a lot of admiration for the Singaporean model, which is obviously a little bit different from the strong liberal democracy that you have advocated. What would you say to the people who advocate India's own Lee Kuan Yew?
Well, I would say two things. One, I would say if China is lucky, it could morph into a giant version of Singapore. Then, second thing for India is concerned, I would say that Singapore has been extremely lucky. You don't have an amazing dictator like Lee Kuan Yew, who has created one of the greatest miracles in history. And but you cannot guarantee that Lee Kuan Yew's will continue for forever. And besides, I think for India, as I told you, that India can never have that kind of state. You know, we are just too unruly people.
That's a good thing. In the back. Yes, you. Go ahead.
So one of the points you mentioned was that certain social programs like the NREGA, National Rural Employment Guarantee Act, they're kind of taking away from the focus of growth. But wouldn't you say, considering the thing you mentioned earlier about job growth's really creating more for the economy, supporting more people, wouldn't you say that act is actually helping promote growth and like personal sustainability within India?
Well, I wish if the jobs produce something. These are make-work jobs. These are jobs that don't produce anything. Their purpose is to create jobs, not to produce something. So I would love it. I mean, if you could employ that kind of numbers to do actually productive work, that would be terrific. But it doesn't happen that way. The way it happens, what we should have done is to have actually built roads, power, and these are things that create jobs in the end. And I have no problems with social programs. A country like India needs those programs. But what this government did was a false trade-off. It took the eyes off the ball when it came to growth. it actually turned hostile to business. They brought in these retrospective tax amendments and all that, which totally scared investors away.
Again in the back, you were waiting.
I'm an undergraduate here at Haas. I'm applying to go to a travel study program to India for this winter. And one of the things that we're studying there are frugal innovations, or I don't know how to pronounce this, but jugaad innovations. I'm wondering how that affects India's future.
Well, that's, I think it affects the future more in terms of attitude. In other words, the attitude of the people is that you can solve the problem. Now, if you've got that kind of attitude, that you can do it, now they'll cut corners, they'll do it in whatever way, but the attitude is, I've got to solve this problem, I've got to do it. And I remember even in my company, I was the first brand manager of a product called Vicks Vapor Rub. And we, I must say, I say we because that was the company, I made it in the world's largest Vicks market, both in sales and profits. And one of the reasons for success was jugaad. First of all, we noticed that the blue bottle, which was sold in 133 countries, was just not affordable for 80% of the people. So we came out with this 5-gram tiny little tin. In the early days it was a tin, then went to plastic. But it's the idea of an affordable pack for the people. And we priced it so low that you could have bought 4 of those and you would be doing better than actually buying a 19-gram jar, which was more expensive. But we banked on the fact that people, middle-class people, just won't buy that, those little ones, because they wouldn't think it's their dignity and all that. So that's jugaad in a way. But there are many, many examples you will find of jugaad. And to me, frankly, that spirit is why India is moving ahead and is going to keep moving ahead, despite a terrible education system. We have an education system based on rote learning, memorizing, passing exams, terrible. And people just on the street, as soon as they come out from those schools, they come to this country, for example, and they do so well. And you can see them in Silicon Valley. They've done well, partly because of that attitude.
So I've just about begun reading your book, and very early on in your book, you make the point that somehow the founding fathers of the country forgot about governance in the fact that too much accountability has to be placed in checks and controls. We also know that in a country like India, checks and controls have brought about some remarkable pieces of information. Even the RTI Act is, in fact, a check and control.
Correct.
So how do you balance governance?
Correct. I think that's an excellent question, and that's the heart of the whole discussion. That how do you get a balance? Right now, the balance in the U.S. Congress is not right. So you've got to fix that. And it's not easily done. There's no answer. There's no easy answer as to how Obama will get through with this, even this watered-down bill. The issue really is state capacity. We keep forgetting. We always think of accountability. Every night, on the talk shows, the government should fix this, the government should do that. But nobody says, it's a question of not the what, but the how. How should the government do it? And I think you've been lucky in this country. You've been expanding state capacity alongside for hundreds of years. But in India, we basically have not done it. the number of judges per 1,000 population, the number of policemen per 1,000 population is staggeringly low.
We have time just for these three last questions, if they can be brief, please.
Hi. Firstly, thank you for coming down to Berkeley. It's a privilege and honor to see you speak in person, so thank you for that. Got two questions for you. The first one was a very interesting one, and it relates to you talking about India focusing on accumulation and China focusing on assimilation, and you gave the analogy of the soup and the biryani. I would like you to elaborate a little more on that. And the second one is, since you spoke so much about politics, I'm so curious to see what's your opinion on Narendra Modi? And do you think he's going to change the face
I knew
of
that.
India?
I was wondering when that question was going to come.
I was going to ask if somebody did.
Well, I think I basically expressed the biryani versus the soup idea. Essentially, the fact is that you have the Chinese are a very homogeneous people, and that's why they have great difficulty in people like the Tibetans who are not Han Chinese to absorb them. They cannot assimilate them, and that's a very serious problem for them. In India, we're just, I wish we were a little better at assimilating, but that's how we are. We just accumulate things, and we just don't throw away. And that's why I think India could only be a democracy, because that's the only way you can run a country with thousands of interest groups in it.
Is that the next question there?
Modi. I think let's talk about Modi. Now, No, it's all right. My last two columns in the Times of India have been about Modi and Rahul Gandhi. So if you want to see them on the blog. But essentially, it's what we call a dharma sankat. Dharma sankat means a moral dilemma for a middle-of-the-road Indian like myself. Because I know Modi is our best chance to get back to 8% growth. He'll just do it by ungumming the bureaucracy. The second thing is that Modi also will be tough on corruption. So it'll be we can have a reasonably corrupt-free governance. But Modi is communal. So which is more precious to you today? Some people will say, my wife says, secularism above all, I cannot. But I said, what about the demographic dividend? What about the millions of jobs of people that will come if you go back to 8% growth rate? And she says, we can wait. And that's how she thinks. But I, myself, for the first time, I'm tempted, frankly, because I realize that corrupt-free governance and high growth are very, very important for our country. And so what you do is you say, well, maybe in 5 years, let's hope we won't have a Godhra-type event occur. And you sort of try to think that way.
Right. Two more questions, please.
Sure. It's really interesting you mentioned that for Indian farmers, it's the best bet to leave villages and find job opportunities in urban or encourage urbanism. I'm just wondering, would it be possible for India to undertake massive agricultural reforms and make the farmers rich so that they can stay in the villages itself? They don't have to go to the urban areas. Because if you look at India, India is unique in the sense it has more than 50% of its employees as farmers, they are professional farmers. At the same time, they have a large agriculture farm area too. So why not bank on that fact and why not?
Okay, I got your question.
Okay.
Now the reality is, yes, we should do agricultural reform, improve the productivity of agriculture, but you can't go against history unless you can provide good schools. You can provide all the infrastructure that people want in a city. They're not going to live on the farms. And so I think, let's not try to go against the grain of history. That's how every country has done it. And India, no son of a farmer wants to be a farmer. That's the truth. But this doesn't mean that first part of your point was very good.
Okay. Next question.
Well, thank you for your talk. So you just talked about Narendra Modi and governance there. So my question is basically about governance. There are elections in Delhi in a month, and the Aam Aadmi Party is contesting. They have a good chance of winning. That party is the party of the middle classes, as such. Well, but their main agenda is governance. So how do you see, because governance, essentially the problem probably is because of the political system in a country, which is divisive.
So what are the prospects of the Aam Aadmi Party? That's your question. Right?
Because governance depends on political reform.
Yeah.
So
right. I'll tell you my problem with the Aam Aadmi Party. I think it's a good thing. This new party, young middle class, has come up. But they are politically so confused. They don't even believe in the reforms. They want to take India back to licensed Raj. Their answer to high prices is cut price by half. Bas. Tomorrow, I'll be the leader and I'll say that all prices should go to half. That's their answer. Now, this is ridiculous. And so, it's not a liberal party. It's got very strong illiberal tendencies. And so I wish, by the way, I have a whole chapter on Kejriwal and corruption in this book of mine, because we had a very interesting discussion. And unless these people say that they believe in the market, are we going to go back to socialism or communism?
Well, I think we've taxed our speaker tonight a great deal, and a very rich and interesting conversation, so please join me in thanking him.
And on behalf of the Dean Speaker Series, we'd like to thank you for an insightful and honest discussion, so thank you. Okay. Thank you, everyone, for coming.